All right, so what Mark and I are going to talk through today is finding content in SharePoint Embedded. We've had a number of sessions in the past on what SharePoint Embedded is for those of you that are familiar with it, how to get comfortable with using it, setting it up in your environment. But what we really wanted to focus on today is now that you've got your content in SharePoint Embedded, how do we find it? And a couple things that we want to focus on are a couple features that we have in SharePoint Embedded. First of all, we have the AKA search. So traditionally, when we think of finding content, we think of searching of it. We're putting it into the index as we're adding content to those containers. And then we're using the Microsoft Search API over that content, the metadata that's in the content, and delivering those results. So once we get those results out of the API, now we can format those, do what we need to present that to the user. But one thing that we really want to also focus on is enumeration. That query string way of using filtering and sorting and arranging and different options that we can also pull content out of those containers and use it. So enumeration, think of, you may have a line of business application where you want to pull in specific documents that meet certain criteria. Enumeration might be a great way to do that, in addition to some of the traditional search mechanisms that we normally have. So how do we get started? So the first thing that we need to do is naturally on our containers, we need to create that metadata. So this is where we have the ability to create metadata through the Graph API. There's endpoints that will allow us to focus on the container. We want to include that in the search index so that we can use that here shortly. And then there's multiple different column types that are supported as you would expect. Text, date, choice, and the list goes on. Once we've added that to our containers, this is where we can now assign it to the specific objects. And objects meaning documents. So traditionally, we're going to put documents into a container. We're going to tag it with the metadata that we have configured on that container. So in this case, you may have an invoice amount, an invoice number, project number, whatever pertains to that specific document. But you can also put metadata on that container. So those of you that are familiar with the property bag in SharePoint, think of it that way. We want to be able to put a project name on a specific container and then do a result set to determine, hey, what are all of the containers that meet this project number, project name, date, and so forth. Okay. Now that we've got our metadata assigned, this is how we're going to find it. Couple different ways. We talked about search a little bit already. So think of the KQL way of going in and focusing on those specific documents or containers that match that search criteria. You can also do full text searching on the documents, narrow that down by the metadata searching. This does go into the SharePoint search index. So be aware of that. There could be some latency that happens with that search categorization. But let's focus on enumeration. So enumeration is also that real-time updating. So there's no delay as it's going, being added to the documents or the container. This is query string driven. So we're going to have a couple examples here on how to specifically focus on what that query string parameter looks like. The context is documents in a single container. So that's kind of the bigger difference that we see with search. Search is pretty easy to go across all containers. Enumeration, we want to focus that a little bit more on that single container approach. And enumeration does support both application and delegated permission. So when you're setting up your environment, that is where you're going to focus on that configuration. All right. All of that is security trimmed. You've got governance that's maintained over the documents as you would suspect. And the JSON response that you get from the API is going to be focused accordingly. All right, so a couple things on search before we go into enumeration, and then Mark's going to walk us through some demos. The core request of a search is just that. This is the post, so focus on that entity type. If it's a drive, then it's going to be a container. If it's a drive item, it's going to be documents. And you can focus that query down to a specific container, specific metadata, really whatever the KQL is that you want to focus on and get those results back. That's where that query string parameter comes into play. Include hidden content. This is something that you do need to include if discoverability is turned on. or disabled, I should say. So make sure that as you're forming your query, that's included in there, and you can focus on getting those results back. So from a search perspective, these are the typical API requests that you're going to do to get search results back. A little different on the enumeration side. So remember, enumeration is focused on those query string parameters. Again, we need to specify what is that container that we're focused on. What is the filter criteria? Again, metadata that we want to narrow that down to, but then also determine what are the fields we want to have come back? What are the, do we need to expand certain complex fields that are in the results? And then how are we going to order that? Okay, so this is where we have flexibility around those containers and some of the advanced queries to get that back. All right, Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you to walk us through a few examples.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. Please holler if you can't. But what we're looking at is just Postman. It's an API Explorer that I have running as an extension in Visual Studio Code. Yeah, so as Steve mentioned, you talked a little bit about metadata and enumeration and search. These are really just kind of tools in your tool belt that you can use to find content in SharePoint Embedded and that you can kind of use to build on your application. And so really, the ultimate intent here is to be able to support the scenarios that you want to enable in your application. So what I want to do is just go into metadata a little bit. It's kind of like some foundational stuff and just show you how you can set metadata on some of the different concepts that Steve was talking about. We're going to really just kind of look at these requests for metadata. I'm not going to make them, but when we do some of the enumeration and searching, I'll show you actual requests running. It's just I've already set up a whole bunch of metadata for this demo. Just kind of give you a sense of how you can do that. And so we have these containers within SharePoint Embedded. If you haven't come across SharePoint Embedded or containers before, it's as Steve mentioned, there's previous talks that we've done on that. But the real kind of quick way to think about a container, it's kind of like a document library within SharePoint. Other than that, it's headless, and so you can build your own app on it and store files and documents in containers. But a container can have these things called custom properties, and you can see here, this is how you set them. And so you can have a handful of these custom properties, give them a value, and indicate whether they're searchable. So that's pretty straightforward. More interestingly, though, is you can actually set up a schema for a container. And this is, we could spend hours talking about this. It's all documented on our Learn documentation. So if you browse in the Microsoft Graph docs, all of the APIs here are available on Microsoft Graph. You can take a look at how you can actually set different types of columns on your container and really define a schema there. And so here you can see this request. This is how we define a text column. But you can see there's a whole bunch of different column types that are supported: Boolean, date, time, currency, and more. And so, yeah, go ahead and take a look at this in our Postman collection or in our documentation and see how you can set the different column types. Once you have defined kind of a schema of columns in your container, when you have documents or files in there, then you're going to want to be able to set the values for those columns, or fields they're called, on those individual files. And that's how you're going to really be able to use the power of this metadata to be able to enumerate and search. And so here, this is just a quick example of how you can set the approved field. So that's one of the columns that I added on my container, and you can set it to true or false. Or if we have text fields, we can set them here. And so that's really pretty straightforward for metadata in your application, depending on obviously your application needs. That's how you want to kind of set up your metadata corpus on there. With all of that set up, I want to show you kind of, okay, how do we enumerate? And as Steve mentioned, like, enumeration is how we kind of find stuff in real time. So here I'm going to, in this request, I'm just going to enumerate or kind of list all of the containers that belong to my application. And I'm just going to select, the ID and the display name. So a really kind of tight result set here. Good. So when I do that, you can see I have 3 containers, or, buckets that I can put documents in, really. 3 containers in my application. One's called planning, another one's called marketing, and another is called projects. Each of these containers has metadata columns associated with them. So I went ahead of time and set up metadata for them. There's some shared columns and there's some columns that are specific to each of these containers in there. But pretty straightforward. I'm going to drill into this marketing container so you can see what one of these containers looks like. So again, I'm just going to get one specifically and get its custom properties. So here you can see I've set some custom properties on this container itself. So it's kind of metadata at the container level. And I've set tags for it, so value, Northwind traders, and I've indicated that it's searchable, and a department, value of marketing, and then a URL path that is not searchable. So that's a pretty straightforward way of setting metadata on the container object itself. Now I want to just kind of show you the real heavy lifting of enumeration. And so what I'm going to do here is get all of the files in the marketing container. How do I do that? Well, there's a couple of different ways, but using this items endpoint on graph, which by the way, this is just an existing Drive item endpoint within the Drive endpoint on Microsoft Graph that you can use. And I'm filtering by parent reference ID. This just happens to be the ID of the root folder where all of these files live. So I'm going to get that. And you can see we've got a bunch of files here in this container. Add slogans and a couple different incarnations of that. Looks like a PowerPoint document here, another PowerPoint, and an image. So I think we've got about 5 files within this container. Great. So you can actually get the content that you have in a container. That's just enumerating everything. Now what we're going to do is go into this other request called approved marketing files. And what I'm going to do here is something slightly more interesting. I'm going to use that metadata that we set up on there. So in the marketing container, I have set up a Boolean approved column, and I've given a true or false value to each of the files within there. Now I'm going to use basically that same query we just looked at, and I'm going to get all of the files that have been approved, which is just a field that my application can use to be able to control, view, and list things. And I'm going to do one more interesting thing is just order by the last modified date time. And so just kind of show you with enumeration, you can filter based on your custom metadata, and you can sort that stuff too. And so here I've got a PowerPoint file that we can see when we go into the field set for here that it is indeed approved. And there's a handful of other files that are approved. So that's pretty straightforward. We also have this piece of metadata called department. And here I'm just one more additional filter. I'm just looking for the files where it is approved and the department is engineering. And so again, just showing how you can kind of combine metadata here. And I think in this result, I only have one file that is approved within the Department of Engineering. So pretty straightforward stuff, but just showing you how you can kind of do enumeration. As Steve mentioned, I just want to highlight this point. Enumeration is immediately consistent data, so you get real-time results. So if I go update, whether a document is approved and I enumerate again and I go fetch those results, it's going to immediately show the true state of the world. But it doesn't scale out across containers. So you can do enumeration within a container and get the files within the container. You can't do it across your entire app corpus where you may have hundreds of thousands of containers. Enumeration does not support that. When you want to do high scale finding of content, search is the way to do it. And so that's where I'm going to go into here now in the search folder, and we can kind of take a look at what some of those requests look like in here. So search is very powerful. It handles scale really well, but the data is latent, meaning it takes a while for the search index to get updated when you update your content within containers. So a few different requests I'm going to go through, and then I'll wrap it up. You can see here, I'm going to search for drives. So this is effectively containers, and I'm going to pass in my container type ID, which is effectively my app ID. So I'm going to find all of the different drives that belong to my app. And you can see here, remember when we looked across our containers, I had the marketing, projects, and planning containers. Well, you can use search to find those as well. Now you can also use search though to filter out different containers. And so for here, I'm doing that same filter, that query that we looked at where I'm getting all the containers or drives for my app. but I'm adding title as marketing. So I'm just going to filter that down. So again, you can have hundreds of thousands of containers. This gives you a way to be able to find containers based on, different properties of them. And so I found that marketing container. What's cool, I mentioned, so if we want to search, we can search really quickly and easily across our entire corpus. And so maybe I want to find all of the files now. And so I'm going to search for drive item, which is effectively files, across my entire app corpus. So I could have tens of millions of files across hundreds of thousands of containers. This is going to find it really quickly, and I'm going to extract some of those fields that I mentioned here. So that query comes back. I'm not going to, take you through this exhaustive list, but you can see it's returning a whole bunch of files. And if I go to the bottom, you can see I have 25 files stored in different containers in my application here. And search is the way to quickly find them. We can also search for marketing files. And so if you recall, I have that container, marketing container ID. So I have the ability not just to search for all files across my corpus, but if I know a particular container that I want to find stuff within, I can do that. And I can easily use that container ID property to be able to filter and just find the files within a specific container. So I can use that as, a well-defined property to search within and get that. I can even narrow it down within a container. So I want to be able to find approved marketing files. We do have some interesting syntax here. For longtime SharePointers, you may recognize this. But basically, it's the same thing I did with enumeration. I want to find the files within the marketing container that have been approved. And when I do that, it's going to effectively get that same set that we looked at with enumeration. Just give me those two files that have been approved within the marketing container. But we can do different filtering across the whole corpus again. So now I'm going to go across all containers for my app, and I'm going to get all Word documents. So this is, again, just showing you some of the stuff you can do. I can, get all of the Word documents across my entire app really quickly. And then one of the other main strong points of using the search endpoint is the ability to do full text search of the document content. So here I'm going to find all documents that contain the word project across my entire application, across potentially hundreds of thousands of containers. I'm going to be able to find all of the documents that contain the word project, and it's going to come back with that and give me a little bit of a summary and excerpt from that. Similar to what we did with enumeration, I'm going to find all engineering files. So across my entire app, I'm going to find that department. So department is a piece of metadata that I have on all of my containers, and I want to find all of it. Now, this is one thing I couldn't do with enumeration that I can do with search, is to be able to span that metadata search for engineering files across all of my containers. And you can see it comes back with that. And I've got 7 documents across those containers. And then similarly, I can narrow it down to combining multiple pieces of metadata across my entire app and want all approved engineering files. I think you get the drift by now. It's going to come back with that approved document that was in tagged with the Department of Engineering. So that's a quick tour. I think I'm out of time, but shows you how you can find content and leverage metadata to be able to find content using both enumeration and search. So you've got good tools to be able to locate your content within SharePoint Embedded. That's it for me. Thank you.